Were you surprised that Governor Newsom vetoed this? Did you think you had his support?
Well, my bill was pending for almost 2 years. And then before me, for the first 2 years of Governor Newsom's term, my colleague, Senator Susan Eggman, had the same bill pending. So we had, between the two of us, the bill pending for 4 years. The governor had made some positive comments publicly. When Jerry Brown vetoed a similar bill in 2018, and Governor Newsom was running for governor, he made a statement about disagreeing with Governor Brown's veto. He made a statement after he took office that he was, quote, very, very open to it. So we had gotten some not a commitment that he would sign it, but some positive signals. We did not get any negative feedback until very shortly before the bill physically went to his desk. And so at that point, I realized that he very well might veto it. But before that, he hadn't really said anything about our bill. And again, listen, I've known Governor Newsom for 22, 23 years, back to when he was a new member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in the late 90s. And I support him. I consider him a friend. I'm aligned with him on the vast majority of issues. I just really disagree with him on this one.
Is there any chance he's going to move his position on this?
I don't know. If he were to change his position, or if his, folks came to us and said, hey, if you make X, Y, and Z changes, he'll sign the bill, then we would want to reintroduce the bill. But at this point, we haven't gotten that indication. And so, I would love for him to change his perspective, or at least let us know what we need to change. But again, we haven't heard anything.
You talked about a lot of people that are on drugs, are unsheltered, or you can be unsheltered and you start using drugs because of the lifestyle that you meet out there. And there are thousands of unsheltered living locations in and around cities in California and across the country. California's got the climate, of course, so I think we've got, 53% of the homeless people in the country are in California.
Of the unsheltered home, we have 25% of overall homeless, and 53% of the unsheltered homeless.
Yeah, 53% of the unsheltered, but clearly because of the climate, you'd rather be here than somewhere in North Dakota when it gets wintertime.
There's that, but also the cost of housing here is so extreme compared to most other states. That's why Utah was able to be so successful in addressing street homelessness. They were able to really quickly create housing on cheap land, which is much harder in California.
Yeah, we don't have cheap land, that's for sure.
That's for sure.
Yeah. What do you think about this move to eradicate, whether you call it a sweep or move these encampments, outlaw camping in these areas or whatever? Is this inhumane? What do you think about this? What needs to happen to these folks?
As long as we have to have somewhere for them to go. If when you sweep homeless encampments with nowhere for people to go, that's just going to reemerge somewhere else. And so it's important to have enough shelter, what we call navigation centers, which is sort of more modern, more effective version of shelters, and have places for people to be, where there's low barriers to get in there. And then I think it's not okay to have tents on sidewalks in these encampments in the middle of neighborhoods when there are places for people to go. And so, but we have to have those options for people for it to be effective.
Well, where does that come from? If we've got all of these people now, and driving to the studio today, I come down Sunset, Santa Monica Boulevard, Vine, some of the major thoroughfares in this part of LA, both sides of the street are lined with tents, and a lot of them are in front of businesses. I don't know what those people do business-wise, because people just simply won't walk through there to go through a business door. I understand these people have to have somewhere to be. I also understand these people have a business that they've got to make a living. Yeah. If they don't stay there, where do they go?
Yeah, the tent situation in LA, also in San Francisco, it's untenable. It has huge impacts on communities and huge safety issues for a variety of reasons, including to the occupants of the tents. And so that's why, but we have to have a place for them to go. And we don't have enough shelters in California in general. And there are cities that refuse to allow shelters, and we have state law that requires them to allow it, but it's still a problem. So shelters are not the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution is housing, but we absolutely need more shelters. I don't know that we need to go as far as New York City, which New York City has just a massive mega shelter system, which some would say takes money away from permanent housing. But regardless, we do not have enough shelter in California. We need shelter, and it needs to be flexible shelter so that people are willing to go there. And once we have that, and I think, in some parts of the state we do better than others, I think it's not acceptable to have tents on the sidewalk. It's very, very negative for a community.
I've pulled over and talked to some of the homeless people, and I've had failed attempts and successful attempts. I've pulled over and tried to talk to some of them that are so mentally ill that they can't have a coherent conversation. Some that are so drugged out they can't have a coherent conversation. I've had some that would seem to make excellent staff. They're sharp, they're focused, and they just seem so capable, yet so stuck in the situation they're in. I've talked to them about shelters, and those that can carry on the conversation, which frankly are a high percentage of them, will tell me, look, going into a shelter is not an option for me because if I do, I can't take my belongings and they'll be gone the next morning. I have a pet. I can't take my pet, and I'm not going to abandon my pet. I have to check in and out every day. So it's not a permanent solution for me, or even a temporary situation, because I got to be out by like 7 or 8 the next morning. I have to be in by a curfew. So it's just not tenable. I'm not going to lose what little I own or abandon my pet. And it's not safe in there, by the way. So you can talk about shelters to me, but I'm not going in there is what they tell me. It's just not a good idea.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. And that's why we have this newer model called navigation centers. And what a navigation center is, it allows for an entire encampment or a group of people just to bring everything in and be there and not have those same really strict rules that are a incentive for people not to go. And so at these navigation centers, people can bring their dogs, they can bring their belongings, as long as they don't have weapons or something that, and they can also, instead of being gender segregated, they can go in, with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. You don't have to be separated. And they provide various navigation services there. People are interested in trying to pursue housing or addiction treatment, or they have another health problem, or their dog is sick and they need, their dog to get veterinary attention. They provide that. And we have them in San Francisco. They've been very successful. They are a good model to, over time, replace the traditional shelter system because they are much more flexible. You don't have to leave at 7 a.m. And it creates a better incentive for people to actually take advantage of it.
Okay. Are these climate-controlled buildings? Are they warehouses? What are they?
They vary. In San Francisco, we have a few of them that are outdoors. Uh-huh. So it's a
fenced-in area,
fenced-off, fenced-in area, but it's outdoors. And like for example, we had one in the Mission. There was a parking lot that was going to be developed for housing, but it wasn't going to be for a few years. So they allowed the city leased it at a very low rent for a few years as an outdoor navigation center. Others where it's outdoors, but they built these smaller structures, so there are indoor spaces. There are some navigation centers where they'll buy an old building that has rooms in it and people get to stay in a room. So it's not permanent housing, but you have your own space. And so it's a very flexible model, and it can be in a lot of different kinds of configurations.
Now, what's the cost of having somebody in a navigation center as opposed to having them in a temporary housing or housing?
I think it depends on where you are. San Francisco it's probably going to be a lot cheaper than substantially cheaper than having someone in housing. In a lower cost area, it might be a little bit closer. I don't, off the top of my head, know the exact current cost of having someone in a navigation center. It can be done. There's a real cost. I mean, it needs to be appropriately staffed. You need to have the right supplies there, the right services there. So, being able to offer people services.
But it's cheaper. It's cheaper than housing.
It is cheaper than housing.
What I'm trying to think of is if we can come up with a plan that gets people off the sidewalks, that keeps the merchants from being in a hardship situation, then it seems to me that is a viable alternative. And I was reading about your navigation centers. I know there are a couple of places in LA that are just that. They're really big fenced off areas, and they do have security on the gates. They're not armed, but they're patrols that go through, and they do have radios so they can call for help if they need, for medical help or whatever.
Right.
And I just got the sense that people felt a lot safer in that environment than they did just out on the street.
Yeah, I think they work well. And we've actually made some changes to state law. I had a legislation I authored that was enacted in the law to make it easier for people to open up these kinds of navigation centers. Because there's always community resistance. And a lot of times they're mad that people are on the street, but then when you try to create other options, they oppose that too. And so we tried to make it easier and more streamlined to get them open.